Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Save the Great South Bay's monthly webinar series on Bay-friendly yards. I'm Robin Silvestri, Executive Director of the organization, and we're very proud to present this month on how to create a butterfly garden in your own yard. I'd like to say thank you to our partners at the Village of Amityville, the public libraries of Amityville, Lindenhurst, and Babylon, along with our friends at the Friends of Connecticut River and the Nathaniel Conklin House for helping to bring this program to the public. Save the Great South Bay was formed in 2013 when two SMPIL alumni returned home to attend a reunion and were appalled at the state of the bay. They had remembered it as blue, clear water, the way they would swim and sail and clam and fish. And when they came back, they found a bay that had been taken over by brown tide. It was mucky and chocolatey, and it was not pleasant to look at or to smell. So then and there, they decided they were going to do something about it, and they formed our organization. We are a 501c3 environmental nonprofit that promotes programs and policies to protect and preserve the Great South Bay. We do this through three particular ways. The first is our Creek Defender program. We work together with municipalities, local civic organizations, student organizations, Lions Club, Rotary clubs, really deep in our local communities to patrol and identify areas in need along the 50 creeks that lead into the bay from Massapequa to Mastic. Second, we were very proud to launch our shellfish restoration effort in 2020 in the form of the Great South Bay Oyster Project, through which we supported our local oyster farmers as they were struggling during COVID. But we also got to restore some oyster habitat to the bay, which is really important for the natural filtration capacity of oysters. One oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. Can you imagine what millions of oysters could do for the quality of water in our bay? And third, our third area of work is the habitat restoration, and part of why we're here today. We promote native habitat restoration through planting of native species, stormwater management techniques, and eco-friendly maintenance, all with the end goal of improving the quality of the water before it actually hits the bay. So I'm very pleased to welcome today Frank Piccininni. He is our Director of Habitat Restoration at Save the Great South Bay, but he is also a biologist, an environmental attorney, and a passionate environmentalist who is dedicated to restoring the functional habitat to our human-impacted landscape. Basically, he's putting back what was here long before we were. Frank received his doctorate at Hofstra University and his degree in biological sciences from Marshall University, along with his BS in wildlife and fisheries conservation from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He is a partner and co-founder at SMPIL Consulting and Spadefoot Design and Construction, where he provides expert testimony for community advocacy groups and habitat restoration services to public, private, and commercial clients. So with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Frank for his about a 25-minute long presentation. Please feel free to put your questions along the way. We'll hold all the questions to the end, but please put your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be sure to get to them at the end of the webinar. So welcome, Frank.
Thank you so much, Robin. Really appreciate it. We want to present today on butterflies, as Robin said, but first, before we do, we thought it was appropriate to share a couple slides that we did go over last month on our last month's presentation about bay-friendly yards, but thought we wanted to sort of repeat it a little bit because it's helpful context to figure out why we got to the place we are. So prior to 1900, Long Island, was largely untouched, dotted with farms. In fact, the current day Pine Barrens is just a fraction of the land that used to exist that were considered Pine Barrens. There used to be a giant plains in both Sayville, centering around the Sayville area and centering around the Hempstead area, referred to as the Sayville and the Hempstead Plains, respectively, which were these beautiful rolling plains of gorgeous native herbaceous plants. There was a almost contiguous chain of Atlantic white cedar swamps all the way from Brooklyn to Montauk before we got here. And this landscape supported a wide variety of wildlife, supported very high water quality and correspondingly a very productive estuary and bay, such as the shellfish population of the Great South Bay. So in the 1920s through the 1940s, we started to create Long Island into really what it looks like today. This is sort of where it all started to happen. So Abraham Levitt revolutionized home building with mass production, right? So it's this quintessential quarter-acre lot, all of South Shore, where everybody has a lawn and a white picket fence, a cesspool, and a token tree. And unfortunately, this is degraded the ecological structure and function of the Great South Bay watershed and really all of Long Island. So Levittown was really the starting place of the suburban way of life, and we continued to sprawl and unfortunately destroy. So it didn't just stop there with single family homes. There's development all across Long Island. And development in and of itself is not a bad thing, but unplanned and unintelligent development is a bad thing. So all across Long Island, we have now these neighborhoods that are smaller lots with all the trees come down, and unfortunately, one of the first few things that people do upon moving to the house a lot of the times is take down their trees. I just don't quite get it. We have a million strip malls. A lot of them are unfortunately now unoccupied, given the fact that ordering things online have reduced the prevalence and the need really for strip malls. So we have a lot of this development, and it's sort of going to waste, so to speak, from a human standpoint, and is continuing destroying the environment from the environmental standpoint. And then things like industrial growth too, and we all know about the Grum and Plume and some of these other travesties on Long Island. So we keep changing the environment, and change in and of itself is not bad, but the change has to be done in a sustainable and conscientious manner. And unfortunately, up to now, it largely isn't done as much. It's all kind of unplanned. And so the result of this is, thousands of acres of natural habitat that used to be a thriving ecosystem is now just sort of sterilized. People use fertilizers and pesticides to maintain sort of this fluorescent green lawn, and that's just senseless and destructive. People introduce purposefully invasive and ornamental species. Go to any box store and you'll see English ivy still being sold. So it's tough. And to top it all off, we have abundant nitrogen pollution and other pollutants associated with stormwater, degrading the structure of water bodies like the Great South Bay. And the part that really bugs us is the fact that we're decimating ecosystems. So by introducing just non-native fluorescent lawns with token non-native plants, we're really destroying the cornerstone of our food web. Really, the connection, for the most part, between plants and higher level organisms are insects. So a good example is the connection between birds and insects, which we'll talk about. So we destroy their homes and replace it with these ornamental species that might as well just be statues, and worse, invasive species that not only serve no ecological function from our standpoint, from the bug standpoint, but also invade adjacent natural areas and really wreak havoc. And we can't live without bugs. Bugs pollinate our food crops. Our entire agricultural system is reliant upon pollinators. And if you remove the insects from the ecosystem, really you're removing the fundamental trophic level between plants and other higher level organisms. And I alluded to birds, and this is really telling and alarming as far as I'm concerned. So a relatively recent paper was published in this journal Science, which is really one of the most prestigious journals out there from a biological standpoint, or really from just a general science standpoint. It's sort of the gold standard from a journal. And they estimate that losses are approaching 3 billion birds, or 29% of the population. And really, one of the biggest things is the fact that we continue to change the landscape and support this quote unquote suburban dream which has been a nightmare from an ecological standpoint. So you take away the food sources from the birds, and go figure, the birds die or don't flourish or come here. So yeah, we really need to turn this thing around, and that's part of the reason why we're here today, is to say that there's hope. There's a lot that can be done in the context of an individual landscape that can really help, especially when taken together in the aggregate. So if we all do a little, it'll add up to a lot. So here pictured is monarch butterflies, and these are beautiful creatures. And gosh, they fly all the way to and from Mexico every year. These little teeny butterflies are gearing up for long flights after they emerge, and they won't just land anywhere. They need compatible host plants for them to lay their eggs, and their larvae will only eat milkweed, for example. And they need adequate foraging habitat. And it's not, your daffodils and tulips, while you might like them and they herald in spring, that's not really packing the same punch as some of our native plants. So what can we do? Well, we can create a landing pad in your own backyard. And as a bonus, you get to watch this beautiful nature show. So if you build it, they'll come. We recently moved into our house in Huntington, and pictured here is a milkweed plant with a bunch of monarch caterpillars. It was the first year we planted it, and it was almost like the butterflies were waiting for me to get it in the ground, and suddenly we had tons of these caterpillars everywhere, and it was an incredible thing to watch. And the really fun part about it is my kiddo just learned watching all this, and just amazingly came and went to pet the caterpillars. We try to stop him from doing that so much, but it was just watching this happen in your own backyard. So how do you do it? Really, it's not that hard. First, check your soil, water, and sun, and we'll go through all these things. Find or plant an anchor, and then choose plants for functional beauty. So these are sort of big. Let's dive into this, and we'll talk about how to create a butterfly garden. So checking on your soil, water, and sun. Really, these are the three big things that tell you how well your plant will be doing. So the first thing is soil texture. So dry, sandy soil with abundant rocks. There's a whole host of plants that'll do well in that type of environment, and then there's plants that'll do well in rich, organic, rich soil that's deep in organic content. So figuring out which plants will do well where is sort of an important thing, and you have to check the hydrology. So certain plants like wet feet, and some of them don't. And so I often use, and we'll provide this link in the when we share the social media, I often use what's the USDA plants database. Now their range maps are a little suspect. So, to figure out what's native, I definitely recommend the New York Flora Atlas or something. But in terms of ecological information, I don't think there's any database that's as thorough as the USDA plants database. And it'll show you, the adaptations of the individual plants that you're looking at. And a good example is their wetland tolerance. So as you can see here, there's a range from wetland obligate species to upland species. So wetland obligate species are those that will only persist if there's hydric soils and water, with a higher hydro period is the term. Whereas upland plants will not flourish or might die unless they're in really dry environments. And then there's a whole range in between. Facultative meaning they're adapted to either wet or dry situations. And then you can shade left or right of facultative, being facultative wetland, so they can grow anywhere. They're well adapted to different circumstances, but they prefer it being wet, and facultative upland. So try to characterize what your site looks like, and then pick some plants and then figure out their ecological properties. And in this way, you can figure out what will do best and where and why. And then second, provide a tree as a home base. So trees create leaf litter. Leaves are not litter. We should be able to keep dense leaf litter under trees, which is really where a lot of these butterflies live over winter, and it provides habitat. And it also, importantly, it creates a lot of host associations. So, interestingly, not every plant has the same ecological value. Not even every native plant has the same ecological value when it comes to attracting pollinators and specifically butterflies. So we recommend choosing hosts that welcome the widest variety of birds, insects, and small and large animals. And there's a really great resource to figure this out. It's the National Wildlife Federation. They have a native plant finder, and we have the link here. The native plant finder, you can actually type in your zip code, and it'll pull up species that support the most pollinators in your area. And funny, amusingly, trees and shrubs are usually the most productive when it comes to supporting large species of pollinators. So everybody thinks, oh, create a butterfly garden. What we really need is a bunch of like pretty little flowers. And yeah, you certainly need that. But really, trees are by far the most productive from an ecological standpoint, from a pollinator association standpoint. So for example, oaks, things like white oaks and red oaks and chestnut oaks, support incredibly 521 species according to the National Wildlife Federation. Beach plum, which is a really versatile, fun one of my favorites. I mentioned it here. I mentioned it in last month's talk. Supports 455 different species. Willows, 431, and birches, 410. So, if you want to bring pollinators and butterflies and moths to your area, well, geez, plant some trees. That's the first thing that you can do. And then, of course, we need to plant some of the forage species, and they also are highly productive, although not as productive. So, things like some of our zip code, the best species from a pollinator standpoint are goldenrods, strawberries, swamp sunflowers, and Joe Pye weeds. So, there's a lot of beautiful native plants that will support these pollinators, and plant trees and herbs is really kind of the message here. And then plant for seasonal color. This is the step 3. So phenology is the study of cyclical phenomena. So for example, what blooms when? And so you should really be cognizant when you're planning a butterfly garden of having something that will be in bloom for the vast majority of the year, or rather having something in bloom at every period in the year. So picking plants so that you have things going in the spring, and then in the summer, and then in the fall. So, spring plants are things like birdfoot violet and other violets, native violets. They're one of the first and critical species that start to pop in the spring when it starts getting warm, and bees and pollinators are starting to fly around. And beach plum, I mentioned on the other slide, you saw how productive it is. It's also so beautiful in the spring. It pops these white flowers, and then, and then you get to make jam from it later on in the year. So one of my favorites. In the summer, stick to like Joe Pyes and milkweeds. So, just having a variety of things that are blooming at different times. And in the fall, look for your goldenrods and asters. So if you pay attention to when things are blooming and plant a combination of plants, you'll always have something in bloom, and you'll always have foraging habitat for the pollinators that you're trying to attract. So here's some designs that we've done through my construction company, Spadefoot Design and Construction. So you can see this pollinator patch was something where, goodness, it's just a sort of wasted, barren patch of English ivy. And not to hate on English ivy, but it has a place, namely England. Here, it's not very productive. And so the recommendation for this homeowner was just to rip all that stuff out, and then we can replant with some native shrubs. So here you have shrubs and plants. So you have some seaside goldenrod in the middle, some bee balm in front of it, some Joe Pye weed and ironweed behind it, bayberries for screening, so that you can kind of screen between the road, and then you have some arrowwood viburnum. So it's a pretty design, and honestly, I think way more beautiful than this, in my opinion, somewhat disgusting patch of English ivy. And then just give him a corner. A gentleman I met by Jay, he actually attended last month's chat and had me over, and we're working on implementing a design for him. So next to give a little plug for next month's topic, which is really more focused on stormwater. This is actually going to be a bioswale to kind of reduce some of the flooding that he has in this area. But we're going to take advantage of it with some beautiful wetland dependent species. So summer sweet is, you can see, incorporated into the design. Some red and blue cardinal flower, two of my favorites that do well in wet areas. And, really, it doesn't have to be the entirety of your land. You don't have to remove all your grass and create a messy looking meadow. I personally think they're beautiful, but I understand why some others think they're sort of messy. But just pick out a little bit, a corner of your land and give it to nature. And you'll appreciate watching these butterflies be attracted to your house. And this is a creative title Robin put together: Bulkhead Blah to Bulkhead Bonanza. So it would be great if we could remove all the bulkheads, but that's not obviously practical, especially on the South Shore of Long Island, where it's so built up. We're right up already against the land, but certainly plant against the bulkhead, because just because there's a bulkhead there doesn't mean the depth of groundwater is particularly deep. So there's, it's keeping some of the standing water off of your lawn, but underground, there's still what's called hyporheic exchange. So basically a mixing of the groundwater or the base flow directly under your lawn and the whatever bay or canal that you're living adjacent to. So you can plant things that like wet feet. And one of my favorite things to plant is seaside goldenrod. It's super versatile. You can see it kind of in this diamond shape that we planted. In the back, there's a blooming beach plum, the back right of the photo and the after photo. And, we planted a bunch of beach grass as well. And just a quick tip on seaside goldenrod, plant them in clusters. Otherwise, they get a little bit floppy. But if you put a bunch of them together, it really starts to become beautiful. And basically the basal leaves, the leaves that hold up the plant kind of hold each other up, and that in turn holds up the stalk of the flower that pops up. So if you plant in clusters, you have beautiful clusters of flowers, as opposed to, if you plant individually, the plants tend to get a little bit floppy. But, so plant up against your bulkhead. Here's a sample pollinator patch. Save the Great South Bay will be offering packages in our store, and with it we will give you a brief design. So just generally speaking, you want to incorporate some layering into your design. So what we try to do here is things that get sort of tall, like the Joe Pye, relatively tall, 3 to 5 feet, say, maybe not that big on the seaside goldenrod, but you get the idea. We put that towards the back of the patch, and as you go forward, you want to kind of grade out and put things that are a little bit shorter. And in the end, it looks way more planned, as opposed to just kind of haphazardly throwing plants together. And ultimately, what'll happen is that it looks sort of messy. And we don't necessarily need to go for messy. And so one of the biggest things you can do to help local pollinators is avoiding the fall cutback. Gosh, just leave it alone. This is actually my side yard, and you can see some of the purple coneflowers, which is the echinacea is a near native, but native enough as far as I'm concerned. Feeds the birds. And we have a bunch of little blue stem here. And actually, as the little blue stem gets covered in snow or in the summer rain, they kind of bend over and create shelter for wildlife. And this hollow stems of the now past blooms of this, these former beautiful purple blooms are now, in my opinion, beautiful interest in the winter, and they shelter native bees that will nest or will overwinter in the hollow stems of these plants. So, an excuse to be lazy. Leave it alone. It's not hurting anybody in the winter, and it's really, really helping local wildlife, including pollinators. And then if you want, you could just plant the seeds. So, admittedly, plugs and, gallon plants get pretty expensive when you're talking about a fairly large area. So you may look into seed mixes. And the cool thing about seed mixes is that you can kind of just throw it out there somewhat haphazardly, and a lot of stuff will grow. But a really important thing to consider is what's in the mix. So I see a lot of folks posting, and I think they're trying to do the right thing. Say, hey, I know this local farm, this local company will sell all this wildflower seed mix. Typically, wildflower seed mix consists of a lot of plants that are not native and sometimes can be aggressive invasives. So be really careful of what you're buying. Figure out what's in the mix and then go from there. What's pictured below is actually in my backyard. I had an area where we just kind of lopped off the grass, and I just sort of experimenting and throwing stuff down. And you can see a bunch of partridge pea, which the bees really love. And this other pretty flower is called Indian blanket. I think really pretty. And it really didn't take much other than me removing the grass and putting the seed down. And then going back and identifying any undesirable plants and kind of pulling them out in order to allow the native plants to become established. And then I have sowing your oats here. If it's a larger area, one technique that we've employed is basically what you do is if you remove the bare land and you can't help that there's a seed bank there, there's other non-desirable, sometimes invasive plants, things like mugwort or foxtails that you don't really want. They're not natives, but they're pretty, they'll start to really take over and maybe outcompete some of the native plants. So oftentimes, what we'll do is sow the native wildflower seed along with non-native oats. And oats are an annual, so you let them kind of grow up together. What'll happen is the oats will grow up very quickly, and by July or so, what you do is go and take like a brush hog or something to that effect, set the blade to about 8 inches off the ground, and hack off all of the oats. The native plants that you seeded will be under the 8 inches, so they will be left untouched, whereas the oats will be hacked off. And because you hack them off in July before it goes to seed, and it's an annual, for the most part, all of them will die back, allowing the native plants to flourish. So really the trick is to kind of get something that'll germinate quickly and then get rid of it before it goes to seed and becomes sort of established on its own. And then your native plants will have had a chance to grow up under the oats and then start to flourish towards the end of the year. And then, the following year, you'll have a meadow consisting largely of native plants. And a fun part is that other visitors will stop by. We have a lot of native, I listened to a beautiful lecture the other day about mason bees and sweat bees. There are a lot of beautiful bees out there. I mean, they're sort of friendly. Honestly, bumblebees are like big flying knuckle-headed teddy bears. You can sort of pet them. A lot of people are worried, if I plant a pollinator garden too close to my house, there'll be bees and I'm scared. And honestly, if they're not defending a nest, they're usually not very aggressive or at all. And a lot of our native bees are just solitary nesters. So there's no nest for them to defend, and they're not an aggressive species. So, and then you get to watch these like metallic green, crazy looking bees flying around, and it's absolutely beautiful. And interestingly, a lot of people, they tend to keep honeybees and have these these bee colonies to create honey and to pollinate the crops. But studies have shown time and time again that our native bees are way more efficient at actually being pollinators than some of the foreign species that we bring in and try to maintain. And as a final point, this is my little sweetheart Russell, and most of what I do, honestly, is for this little guy, and for everybody else's little kids. It's for the future generations. So create a butterfly garden, and not only will you enjoy it, but it'll become like a living exhibit for your kiddos just to watch nature unfold in their yard. I grew up a very blessed childhood on the South Shore of Long Island in North Passapequa, but my yard was largely sterile, and I always wondered why. So don't sterilize your yard, and it'll become such a rich area for your little kiddos to explore, to learn, and to become, to be in touch with nature. And really, it's the next generation that we have to do this for. So thank you so much, and I'd be glad to take some questions.
Thanks a lot, Frank. We really appreciate, as always, you sharing your extensive knowledge with us. We have a couple of questions already to go, but in the meantime, before I get started on the questions, I just wanted to thank some of our board members, including President of the Board of Save the Great South Bay, Todd Shaw, for being on the line today. Todd is also the chairman of our Creek Defender events. We have a ton of community creek cleanups coming in March and April. The information on those will be posted to our social media and our website. Just thought I'd give you a shout out there, Todd. Thank you very much. So let's get started with some of the questions that we have out here, and feel free, everybody, to add your questions in. One of our first questions was from Laura Hickman. Frank, is milkweed deer resistant?
So deer resistance is tough. There's really uh, resistance is an interesting point. We've had deer eating things that they're not supposed to eat, such as ferns. So I think they're largely not preferred, and they'll do okay because they're pretty prolific seeders. So you can plant them, and they'll likely get nipped by the deer if there's a big deer problem by your house. But just keep planting them is my advice. One quick hack that I'm trying to explore for one of my clients on deer resistance. I actually I haven't actually done it yet, but I've read about motion sensing sprinklers, so that when when the deer walk into the garden, they get shot with your water, and it scares them and they run off. And it's obviously harmless to the deer, and your plants get a little water in the process. So it wasn't exactly the question, but I thought I'd share that hack, and yeah, it's sort of deer resistant.
Thank you. Thank you. From, I don't know the name, but is milkweed invasive?
No, it's a native. It can be somewhat of an aggressive seeder, but it's not invasive unless it's not native, and it can destroy the ecological function of surrounding neighborhoods, or tracts of forest. So no, I wouldn't say that it's invasive, and by definition, it cannot be invasive. But the fun thing about it, I think, is once you plant a couple of them, they'll seed themselves and they'll spread, which is what you want.
Absolutely. Thank you. Joni Klein asked, where is the Great South Bay store? Can you answer that, Frank?
It's on our website somewhere. I think if you go to savethegreatsouthbay.org and type in store, you'll be able to find it. And we'll have our plant bundles coming up. I don't know if you want to mention that, Robin.
Yes, thank you. I do want to mention that. SaveTheGreatSouthBay.org is our website. If you visit our store, we will have coming up over the President's Week our spring planting bundles, including pre-selected pollinator packs that kind of take the guesswork out of the phenology, so the finding color throughout the season, as well as bulkhead bonanza packs that are specifically tailored to wetter soils. Lauren Scott asked, can the sample you displayed be planted successfully further inland, say, for example, in the Mineola area?
In fact, it can. I mean, and we purposefully, for the packs that we put together, we purposefully planted plants that are super versatile. So if you remember the slide about wetland obligates to upland species, and there was facultative in the middle, most of the plants that we have in there are either facultative or facultative wetland. So yes is the short answer. That they'll do well in most places.
Terrific. Jane Joan wants to know, where can we get plants and seeds? Well, we are putting together the pollinator pack and the bulkhead bonanza. They'll be coming up. Everybody who's on this webinar will get a quick email when those packs are ready for sale and up on our website. So thanks so much for asking about that. Those will take care of the basic needs for a pollinator garden. Tierney wants to know, can we attract hummingbirds to our area? What are the relationships between attracting hummingbirds and butterflies, Frank?
Well, a lot of the plants that you would plant to maybe attract forage, create forage habitat for a butterfly will also attract the hummingbirds. So specifically, cardinal flower, red cardinal flower, is a really beautiful plant that will attract butterflies. Things like coral honeysuckle, which is a vine, that also attracts lots of hummingbirds. And the thing about hummingbirds is that it might take them a while to kind of find your house as a food source, but once they do, it sort of gets imprinted in their little brains somehow, and they'll come back year after year. So establish, hummingbird friendly native plants like the coral honeysuckle and the cardinal flower, and you'll see these green gems flying around, buzzing around your yard every year.
I want to interject right there, Frank, with my own personal anecdote of trying to convince my husband to give up some of his, classic green lawn. And last year, Frank helped me put in a butterfly garden at my house. It was just a patch of area on my lawn, and I didn't have the plants out of the out of the truck before the bees were already there. It was amazing. It was really amazing. And my husband chuckled as I labored away, installing these, 25 or so plants. But then after that, he was impressed by the number of new species that we had attracted to our yard. And he would sit out on his chair in the front lawn and just watch the garden. He's become a real pollinator garden convert, Frank. So thanks for that.
Sure, it's really addicting.
It
You'll,
really,
you'll find yourself, you buy a couple and plant a little patch, and then the next year, you'll be buying hundreds more, and scoping out the Limpy native plant sale and looking on our website and such. So
Melody
yeah.
Butler asked, she has a particularly shady yard. Any recommendations for where I can plant directly under trees, or for what I can plant directly under trees?
Yeah, ferns do really well. There are Tiarella. It's a foam flower. That's another native beautiful plant. The viola species, such as violets, will do really well. And I'll point you to the USDA website. And there's a tab called shade tolerance. So if you take like your local availability, and type it in, you'll be able to find it. Also, Prairie Moon Nursery, I think that's the one. A lot of these online vendors will have some ecological information about the plants that you're clicking on. So I'd recommend just find a source, a website that's pretty comprehensive with a database. If you don't want to dig through the USDA thing, click on Pretty Flowers and see what their recommendations are as far as shade and wet soils and hydrology.
Terrific. How do we get people to stop seeing nature as dirty or scary so that they want to change their landscaping? I think I know how you're going to answer that, but go ahead, Frank.
Well, I mean, gosh, this is why we do these things. This is why I'm taking the time out on a Saturday, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to do that. It's been a passion of mine since I was a little kid, slopping around in the Massapequa Preserve, chasing after frogs, bringing home turtles. But my childhood was not the same as a lot of my friends' childhoods because they just weren't as engaged in it. And it's just, I think it's just all about teaching, having these kids be immersed within these environments and watching this stuff happen. And one other thing is, I remember when I took like AP Bio and biology classes in high school, a lot of the course material it talked about like tropical rainforests as if nature was the other place. This is where we live. Nature's over there. Nature's everywhere. And we need to start really become immersed into these habitats like Robin's husband and start to learn. And I think a lot of the teachers at local high schools are starting to do it. Tom Dempsey, for example, to give him a little shout out. I'm not sure if he's on the line, but I know he's trying to incorporate some local stuff into his curriculum at Massapequa High School, and a lot of other folks too. So it's about teaching kids and adults alike, and really just being aware and observing what's around you. Maybe a long-winded response to that, but this is a very passionate thing for me.
So Kathleen Pulaski asked, are butterfly houses okay?
Butterfly houses in the sense, I guess what you mean are these like things where people breed butterflies. I'm not sure. So if that's what you're talking about, I see no problem with that. Just kind of giving them a head start. And, I have no real opinion on that one way or the other. But the important thing is to make your yard habitat as far as I'm concerned.
So Frank, Debbie asked, is there an evergreen? I guess she's looking for a green color all year round that is tolerant to salt water.
Bayberry is my favorite. It's not really, it doesn't actually flower. It has these like berries called the drupes. They're not technically berries, but whatever, we'll call them berries. And it's not evergreen in a strict sense that, it's deciduous, and so it would lose its leaves, but it only loses its leaves when the new spring growth is coming. So and it grows pretty quickly, and it's definitely salt tolerant. So bayberry is my pick.
Jason Mantell asked a question: which plant is hardy and doesn't need a lot of attention? I work a lot, but would like to help the butterflies. Thank you, Jason. We appreciate you wanting to do your part. Here at Save the Great South Bay, we say start where you stand. Everybody has to do their part. So how can we help Jason do his part with a minimal amount of work, Frank?
Yeah, that's the beauty of native plants. Some are sort of sensitive and need very specific environments, but most of them are pretty well adapted to our environment here on Long Island. So if you want versatile plants, I mean, click on our pollinator packs that we're putting up. We pick plants specifically for that. But failing that, I mean, a lot of the native plants, especially once they get established, you don't really need to do anything. You just kind of let them be. And so, as opposed to things you buy at a box store or garden center, that's a non-native, something from another climate, another country. You usually have to kind of baby those a lot more. Wrap them in the winter and irrigate them. Native plants, I really don't need to. And a lot of the times, my clients will ask me if I can do irrigation, and our company does irrigation, but only begrudgingly, because most of the time, after the first year that you establish it, the irrigation just goes, it's just waste. It's just pipes sitting underground, not being used anymore because these plants flourish on their own.
Thank you, Frank. So Debbie asked, so Dara Myers asked, I'm sorry, are there any pollinated plants that are container friendly? Suppose some people want to have something on their back porch or in smaller areas that they can keep contained. What do we got for
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the same plants, it seems like a canned answer, but it's the truth. The same plants that in our pollinator pack that we're putting up will also do fairly well in the containers. I mean, have a milkweed container. It'll be fun. You'll see butterflies hanging around, and you don't have to, if you have a smaller area or a deck where you want these plants. I mean, that's, you know, look at the plants we're recommending because they're, purposefully chosen for that reason.
Thank you. Kathy Gomez said, what are good sources for pollinator friendly natives? And I know we keep coming back to, they'll be coming up in our store. My local nursery considers some of the natives I want to be weeds and look at me like I'm crazy when I ask if they carry them. I think that's in part because some of them are actually named after weeds like Joe Pye weed and milkweed, but they're far from weeds. Frank, can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So, well, I guess a specific question. I mean, yeah, I don't really get the nursery trade. I understand why a lot of them would still need to maintain some of the, canned arborvitaes and all these other non-creative, kind of boring ho-hum plants, in my opinion. I get it. There's a market for that. They need to, they need to feed their families and pay their mortgages. But so many of them are missing a huge market in the natives. There's a growing community that's becoming aware of how important this is. And so if you own a store, local store, big box store, just start to carry natives, and I bet you they sell out pretty quickly. Where to get them now? Yeah, our stores is a way to get them. I always have to plug my buddy Matt Gettinger over at Long Island Natives. He's a huge supporter of the organization. He has a minimum order, but one technique that a lot of folks do if they can't meet the minimum order is get together with a bunch of your buddies who also want to order plants, and then you can kind of go in and split the shipping. So Long Island Natives is a great source. Long Island Native Plant Initiative is a great source for local ecotype plants, and they have spring and fall, I want to say, plant sales, or at least like definitely fall. I'm not sure about spring. I think it's maybe every other year, but look out for Limpy because I'm a big fan of them as well, and they support and they have local ecotype plants.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Frank. Maybe it's time for us to have our own plant sale coming in the spring where we feature only the native plants that people can't find at some of the big box stores.
That'd be great.
How long does Joni Clyde wants to know, how long does it take to attract native bees to your garden? Well, I think we've answered this one, but they were the plants were in and out of my truck, Joni, and the bees were already there when I brought the milkweed and some of the I think it was called agastache, Frank, that we brought.
Agastache, a near native, and I like it because it's versatile and has a really pretty flower for the vast majority of the year. So I often try to incorporate that. And it smells kind of nice too. But how long does it take? Honestly, these bees are here. They're dwindling in numbers, unfortunately. And it's when you do plant natives amongst like this sterile neighborhood that most neighborhoods are, unfortunately, they're going to be drawn to your yard almost immediately. They're going to say, oh, look at all that, awesome native plants over there. Let's go fly after it. Whereas, they'll start to leave your neighbor's yard. So it doesn't take long at all to create, to attract local bees. native
Well,
bees.
Brendan had a question. He has, and I'm going to probably butcher the name of this plant. We have evergreen unimus hedges in our yard. Are these okay?
Euonymus, yeah. So so they're from Japan. So are they? I think they're somewhat invasive, but I personally have not seen it spread so much. So it's unlike the burning bush, which is really the euonymus that is terrible. That is, okay, is kind of how I would characterize it. But from a functional standpoint, they might as well just be fake plastic. They're nothing is going to be using them. I mean, maybe a bird will flop around in the bushes, but that's really it. So, they're okay. I wouldn't rip them out necessarily. I would just plant around them.
Thank you, Frank. Kathy Gomez had, are there herbs that are particularly attractive to pollinators?
I'm so sorry. Somebody was asking me a question at my house. What was the question again?
Are there herbs that are particularly attractive to pollinators? Some people like to plant herb gardens.
Well, it's not native, but there's this African violet. I think that's what it's called, and it did really well in my garden. I'm sorry, maybe it's an African sage. Gosh, I don't remember. The bees were all over that thing, and I think things like dill. People ask me about stuff like, oh, how do I restore my grass best, or what about gardening? And I'm like, oh, it's not really native. I don't really know, but parsley, I know swallowtail butterflies tend to be attracted to. And yeah, it would, that's more for you guys, not necessarily for the native bees and butterflies and such.
So Sharon asked, and you may have touched on this already, but how often do you have to actually water a true native wildflower garden?
Well, I like to baby my plants when it's like the most intense part of the year. Like I'll give it a little bit of a drink. You can sort of, if you pay attention to these plants, you can sort of see when they're becoming drought stressed. A lot of their leaves start to wither and they kind of flop over a little bit. But really, once it's established, depending, of course, on the species and the site conditions, you really don't have to water it at all.
Gotcha. Um, an anonymous attendee asked, what can we plant if our yard is largely shady?
Yeah, yeah. So the foam flower is a fun one, and ferns are another good one. Violets work really well, and asters work well too. Like a white woodland aster. It's a fall blooming beauty, and white snake root too is another good one. Although I read somewhere that dogs might eat it and get sick, but those are a bunch of flowers. And again, like if you're interested, go on to some of these native plants like Prairie Moon Nursery I plugged before. You could actually sort by ecological criteria, right? So you could sort by shade tolerance and dry shade, and then they'll give you a list of like 20 plants that'll probably do well.
Yeah. Ashley Ferguson said, do we need to buy caterpillars for our gardens, or do they come naturally? I have to say, I often ask the same question, where do they come from? But yes, go ahead, Frank.
Well, they come from the butterflies that lay eggs on the plants that are specific to specific host plants. So no, you don't have to buy caterpillars; they'll come. And as I alluded to in the presentation, we just I bought a bunch of butterfly weed, which is a milkweed, and planted it this in the middle of the summer, and then there was just caterpillars crawling all over it, and then 10 days later. Now, granted, I have a ton of other native stuff, but I just remember how quickly it happened when we put in the butterfly weed, how quickly the monarchs, it's like they were, waiting for me to plant the stuff, and I planted it. They came, laid their eggs, and there was, a feeding frenzy. It was like that book that I read my little kiddo, The Hungry Caterpillar. It was, plant caterpillars all over the place. So no, you don't have to buy them. They'll come on their own if you give them their food.
Okay, so here's a good one from Kathy Gomez. What's your opinion of deer sprays like liquid fence? Some of our out east, towards the more eastern end of Long Island and the Great South Bay, I guess deer are a serious issue. Are they bad for pollinators?
I haven't read any specific research about the deer spray and pollinators. Allegedly, it's inert and okay. Um, Honestly, though, I'm a little bit suspect. I'm a little, I wouldn't do it. I'd rather figure out a way to spray them with my with like a motion detector, hose or whatever, sprinkler rather, as opposed to spraying deer spray. Just because if you just think about it, if you're spraying stuff that makes it unappealing to deer, the likelihood is that we may not have detected the fact that it has a negative impact on other wildlife, but it likely does if it's but I'd rather you plant native plants and spray them with deer spray than stick to the non-native nonsense and not use deer spray. So that's I hope that's an okay answer. A bit of a dodge, but also I don't know. It's not my favorite.
So John Orsato said he let some goldenrod, he planted up some goldenrod over on Fire Island, and now it's popping up everywhere. So it's native, but it's an aggressive grower. Is that an issue?
No, it's what you want. I mean, it's aggressive in the sense that it'll seed and grow elsewhere. But it's sort of easy to control. If it's in a spot you don't want, it's not like it's hard to pull out. So it's not an issue. It's a benefit to the environment. And goldenrod is a really important one because it's a host. There's a lot of specific. It's a host plant for a lot of specific pollinators. And also it's one of the, like, seaside goldenrod is it's one of the last plants to sort of bloom in the fall. And right when these beautiful butterflies or monarchs are going to start gearing up for a long flight over to Mexico, it's a really good nectar source for them.
Terrific. Chris P also suggested mountain mint I'm guessing in response to an herb that might be butterfly friendly. Does that
Yeah,
sound
that's absolutely right.
good?
Thanks,
So
Chris.
Daniel Paisley over in Babylon asked, we have some lavender that does really well in our backyard and attracts lots of bees. Is that native? And if not, is it okay for to leave it or best to take it out?
Yeah, it's not native. And is it okay? Yeah, sure. Just watch to make sure it doesn't grow anywhere. And if it's invasive, I generally say, rip it out and replace it. If it's non-native, I say supplement it with natives. And then if you run out of room and need more room, then start ripping out the more ornamental kind of stuff and replace that. That's sort of my recommendations for most of my clients. So I kind of get why you like it. And to my knowledge, it's not aggressively invasive. So I don't, what harm is it doing? Unless you need more room, and then you rip it to plant natives.
Brian asked, he has catmint in his yard. Is that native? The bees and pollinators seem to be all over it.
Yeah, I think that one is not native, and it actually might be somewhat invasive to my understanding. So just be careful.
Carol, I'm just going to keep going because we have quite a few left and we're running down to our last 10 minutes of the webinar. But Carol Deerwester asked, should you keep the butterfly garden away from bird feeders?
I don't see why. I mean, the birds will actually eat the caterpillars, and that's kind of we had the slide about this massive wave of extinction for birds. And a big part of that reason is because we're interrupting these trophic levels. So it's all kind of one and the same and natural. So no, I mean, and if you lose some caterpillars to birds, that means you're feeding these beautiful birds. The caterpillars are really high in fat and protein. They're really important food sources for our local birds. So, generally, I would not worry about it.
Great. Are there any native plant species that are safe or unsafe for dogs? As a recent dog owner, and I love my dogs, I think this is a great question. Thank you to the person who asked this one.
Well, I know there are certain plants that have some toxicity. And I think on the USDA website, there's a tab about the toxicity, or you could just Google it before you start to plant it. But it really depends upon how dopey your dog is and how many plants it's going to eat. So, and how much you monitor your dog. And you can't always monitor it, but certainly there are some toxic native plants. The same can be said about non-natives. So it's just about being educated about what you're planting. And there's a bunch of them, so I'm not going to go list a bunch.
Okay, thank you. Will planting natives reduce the mosquito population or have an effect on it?
Well, that's a tough one. So really, as to mosquitoes, I think anytime you create more of a local ecosystem, you're introducing the potential for predators to be, so things like bats and purple martins and dragonflies. Those three things are voracious predators of mosquitoes. So the more of a thriving ecosystem your yard and your neighborhood becomes, the more likelihood that you'll have a lot of these natural predators. Frustratingly, sorry, Suffolk, the Suffolk County, the vector control sprays our marshes with methoprene. And that's killing not just the mosquitoes, anything with an exoskeleton. So all the mosquito predators are getting killed in the process. Sorry, that was a bit of an aside, but will it help? I think it'll help. Things like, I should mention, things like bee balm, by the way, a beautiful native. It has some properties that are thought to reduce the prevalence of mosquitoes. So, it'll introduce, so planting natives will restore the function of the neighborhood and allow you to allow you to restore some semblance of predators, kind of taking down the mosquitoes. One last hack, I learned this reading Doug Talamay's book, Bringing Nature Home, which I'm a big fan of. Grab a bucket from Home Depot, throw some straw in it, tuck it in the corner of your yard, and throw those things called mosquito dunkers. It's BTI, it's a bacteria. You throw them in there, and the mosquitoes will be very much attracted to the buckets. The standing water in the buckets will lay their eggs, but the mosquito dunkers will kill the larvae before they emerge. So that's a safer way to help mosquitoes. So I meandered a bit on that one, but I thought I should cover that one because it's sort of a
right back in. Lauren Scott wants to know, where can we get our soil evaluated? Is that something you can get, to just determine the level of moisture in your soil?
Well, it's really more about taking the subtle cues. I mean, of course, you can do bulk density tests, or like send it off to a lab and get like a soil moisture, but really, what's wet in your yard. That spot where the grass doesn't grow, the likelihood is it's because there's standing water there. The squishy spot in your yard, that probably used to be a wetland before somebody dumped fill on top of it. So you can spend money and get soil tested. York Analytical Laboratories will do it. They're one of our sponsors for Save the Great South Bay, for example. But really, it's just about, in my opinion, just taking sort of subtle cues from the environment and knowing what you know about your yard just by living there.
So kind of a hand feel. Just put your hand in it and feel it. Is it wet? Is it dry? Is it somewhere in between?
That's right.
How much space will the pollinator pack cover? Asked Maria. Maria, I could take that question. Our pollinator packs will be set up to cover about 100 square feet. And we look to set them up so they cover about two plants per square foot. And Danielle Paisley also mentioned that Cornell Cooperative does soil testing. Thank you. Appreciate that answer. Another participant asked Frank, is it important to have water features in your yard for butterflies?
Well, actually, so water features, not as much as butterflies like to do what they call puddling. We actually had a slide on there. I don't know what happened to that slide, but so basically they need to kind of drink and get plenty of minerals. So if you Google butterfly puddler, there's these cute little ceramic things you can incorporate into your garden. But to my knowledge, I don't think the water features are that important for the butterflies. Rather, but that is important for other things like birds.
Right. Okay. And are all butterfly plants annuals, or is it something that will come back year after year?
Well, so all the plants in our butterfly pack that we're selling are perennials. And certainly annuals will also feed the butterflies, but the trick is to get annuals that are going to do well where you plant them. So when they seed, the next year they'll just keep coming back up. But most of the plants that I work with in my professional career they're perennials. So you plant them once and they come back for the most part year after year.
Good. Gigi said, I work for a business along the Patchogue River. The area around the river is infiltrated with invasive overgrown species. Would I be able to contact you for some help on a landscape design? Absolutely, Gigi. You can reach out to Frank at yards@savethegreatsouthbay.org. If we weren't able to get to your question, we have time for just a few more questions. But yards@savethegreatsouthbay.org is, you can email us questions at any point and we'll connect you with some design services. Sharon asks, when do we plant the seeds? Good question, Sharon. And do you have oat seeds?
Well, you can get oat seeds from most. I think there's a place in Farmingdale. Just Google seed supply, and as far as when to plant them, really you can do it a dormant seeding, or you can do it sort of in the spring. The one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of native plants will require what's called cold stratification, and the way around that is to kind of stick them in your fridge with a wet paper towel to add them, or otherwise, in the next fall, you can plant them and they'll stratify on their own, or you could just sow them now. Live with the things that are going to not need cold stratification, will germinate readily, and then next year you'll see some of the plants that that did require the cold stratification start to pop in. So it's really not a bad time to do it, honestly. Best time is fall, though.
Well, thank you so much, Frank, for sharing your Saturday morning with us and your time and your knowledge, of course, most importantly. Again, if you have questions that weren't able to be answered here, yards@savethegreatsouthbay.org. If you missed a part of this or want to watch this whole webinar again, it has been recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel. A link to that will be sent out to everybody who has registered for the webinar. We hope you can join us next month on Saturday, March 13th, as we bring the next edition of our Bay Friendly Yards monthly webinar series, Bay Friendly Yards Recycling Stormwater. We'll be talking about bioswales and rain gardens and other ways that we can help keep stormwater on our properties prevented from washing out into the streets, into our storm drains. And like everything, it all ends up in the bay at the end of the day. So thank you very much. I hope you can join us next month. Thank you, Frank, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see everybody next month.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.